I want to start this morning with a couple rhetorical questions, questions that don't really expect an answer, but like Habakkuk, who we spoke about last week and are continuing this week, have you ever thought that God doesn't seem to stop injustice and sin in the world? And have you ever prayed about something and haven't gotten an apparent answer from God, and you wonder what He's waiting on? Well, last week we looked at Habakkuk's first complaint to God and how God responded to that complaint. Habakkuk couldn't stand the injustice of God not stopping wickedness in the world. But God answered Habakkuk, and He told him that He had planned all along to address the disobedience of His people, and He planned to do this by punishing them with or through the use of the ruthless Babylonian people against His own chosen people. Now, before I get into it, I do want to take maybe a couple minutes and just give an update on one of the illustrations from last week's message, because I really think this is significant. And for those who weren't here last week, and for those who were, just to refresh you, there was a story recently in the newspaper that said there is a temple to the false god Baal that we read about quite often in the Old Testament. And it's in Syria, country of Syria. And last year, Islamic fighters left a path of destruction through Syria, and they destroyed much of this temple. And someone came up with the idea that they were going to move part of an arch to Times Square in New York City, and another one to London. And the update is that I read an interesting follow-up article on the news feed that came across my computer earlier this past week. And in the story, it says that these plans to establish these pagan altars in New York City and in London were suddenly and mysteriously put on hold. Now, only a few outlets, as you can imagine, picked up on the news story, and no one's really able to pinpoint the reason for the sudden halt in the plans. I have not been able to find it in any article that I searched for. So it seems like no one is talking. Well, I find that very curious, first of all, because in the news, journalists always want to explain who, why, what, and in this case, we don't have the significant questions. One journalist that I did read suggested that the broad attention that this story got, especially in Christian media, certainly led to millions praying worldwide for God's intervention, and this journalist suggested that it was the prayers that caused the sudden change in hand. None other than the hand of God stopped this, at least for the meantime. And to me, this seems like a very reasonable explanation, because I have no doubt whatsoever that prayer does work. And I think we should all be encouraged when we clearly see the hand of God working in our midst, as it seemed happened just this past week. This is a case where those who prayed for God's intervention had no choice but to patiently wait on God for a response, and God delivered. The very same thing happened with the prophet Habakkuk, where he resigned himself to waiting for a response from God, and that is a major part of this message this morning. I cannot stress enough how not only is God in control, but how God is speaking to us right now through these biblical events that took place some 2,600 years ago. All you have to do, again, is pay attention to what's going on around you. By the way, this here is a picture, not necessarily the exact arches, but something very similar that they had planned to construct and move to Times Square and to London. So this morning we'll continue exploring the book of Habakkuk. And this morning we will look at chapter 1, beginning in verse 12. And we will finish in chapter 2, verse 1. Just go one verse into the next chapter. And reading from the word of the Lord. Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. The Lord's blessing be added to the reading and to the hearing of his holy word. Like all believers, Habakkuk was growing as a child of God, and we see that growth in this passage. It's easy for us to look at Habakkuk and point to his faults and his misunderstanding of God, but many Christians sadly operate under that same false understanding of God today. In chapter 1, Habakkuk was troubled at God's lack of judgment of sin on his people. Now he is troubled at God's chosen agent of judgment. And this is the first point. Sometimes God just can't win with us. Habakkuk complains because the people around him are indulging in excessive violence and other blatantly sinful behavior, so he cries out to God, "How long, Lord, must I call, but you do not listen?" So God responds by telling him that he is working on it. And he chose to use the pagan Babylonians to attack and overtake the people of Judah. Habakkuk was certainly not expecting this, and he has a major problem with this because he thinks that a good, righteous God shouldn't use evil people to accomplish his will. Now, Pastor David Guzik from California, currently pastoring there, he writes many really good, in my estimation, really good commentaries on the Bible. And he addresses this dynamic in modern fashion. Guzik writes, "It would be like crying out to God about the state of the church in America and hearing God respond by saying, 'I'll fix the problem by a communist invasion of America.' We would say, 'Wait a minute, Lord, the problem is bad, but your cure is even worse than the disease.'" End quote. If God would act as Guzik describes, this doesn't mean that God approves of militant communist invasions. All it means is that he disapproves of the state of the church in America, and you can be sure that he also has judgment planned for the communist militants on another day. More than anything, we learn from Habakkuk that we need to trust that God knows best. And there are a lot of things in this world that seem to contradict. And I'll illustrate this this way. Now, do we have any NASCAR fans here this morning? Anyone really like NASCAR? We have a few. Okay, a couple. Honestly, I'm not a NASCAR fan by any stretch, but I do appreciate the skill of the drivers. I mean, every day I drive for about 15 miles one way on Route 81, and during rush hour, it can seem like the Daytona 500 out there. So, yes, I can appreciate what they do. Even though I don't follow NASCAR, I do remember about 15 years ago hearing of the death of Dale Earnhardt. Picture on the screen. To refresh your memory, near the end of the race, I think it was the very last turn, Earnhardt crashed his car going about 180 miles per hour. And this wreck, I remember, didn't even seem that bad as far as NASCAR wrecks go at the time. I remember hearing analysts say they were very shocked that he didn't survive the crash because, again, it didn't really look that bad. Now, as a sports fan, I then saw scores of stories on focusing on NASCAR safety. According to the autopsy report, Earnhardt died of blunt force trauma to the head. Medical professionals suggested that maybe he might have or probably would have survived the crash if he were wearing a safety device called the Hans device. This is basically a state-of-the-art head and neck restraint that limits the movement of the head and neck in high-impact situations, thus reducing the chance of severe head and neck injuries and even death in the case of Earnhardt. At the time, like many other drivers, Earnhardt decided against using the device, complaining that it restricted his movements and it was uncomfortable. His decision quite possibly cost him his life. The numbers are staggering. I looked up, and from 1990 to 2001, about an 11 or so year period, there were 19 NASCAR collision deaths. In the next 8 years, after Earnhardt's death and more emphasis got put on the Hans device, there were 7 collision-related deaths. And currently, in NASCAR anyway, we have gone about 8 years now without a single collision death. You see, the problem in NASCAR is clear. The issue was injury and death due to high-speed collisions. But there is a solution to the problem, and it is called the Hans device. However, it took time for the drivers to warm up to this. In other words, many drivers felt that the solution was worse than the problem. In an interview shortly after Earnhardt's death, fellow driver Mark Martin said, and I quote, "I would not wear one for anything. I'll just keep my fingers crossed and take my chances," end quote. Martin, in a sense, had a Habakkuk moment there, thinking there's got to be another solution. There's got to be another way. And that's often how we are when we question God. The second main point this morning has to do with patience. In the society we live, we demand things faster and sooner, and I want it now. You know all about it. We have cell phones and the internet and those kind of things that cater to our needs faster than ever before, and we quickly become accustomed to the speed that we are catered to. Mankind, I think, has always been impatient to one degree or another, but recent technology makes us even worse now. You know, we don't want to wait no matter where we are going. And this affects our relationship with God too. When we have an issue that we bring to God, we want our answer now. Just like if I want to know what the weather's going to be this morning, you can type on your phone and pull it up right away. We want God to be like that, and that is not the case. What Habakkuk does is he models for us mature Christian patience, especially in chapter 2, verse 1. See how Habakkuk handles this exchange with God. He said, "I will stand at my watch station, myself on ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. In the popular contemporary paraphrase of the Bible called The Message, written by Eugene Peterson, he tells it this way: what's God going to say to my questions? I'm braced for the worst. I'll climb the lookout tower and scan the horizon. I'll wait to see what God says, how he'll answer my complaint. In short, Habakkuk is prepared to wait for an answer no matter how long it takes. And Habakkuk models the proper Christian behavior in a couple of ways. First, he models the correct attitude and patiently waits for an answer from God. He didn't storm away in a huff whenever God didn't give him his answer right away. It was Habakkuk's faith that gave patience to wait on God. The enemy wants us to be impatient because he knows that when we are impatient, we will miss out on God's answer, and as a result, our faith will not be strengthened. And it's that same strength and patience that we as believers must model as witnesses to the world, examples for everyone to see. The admirable thing about Habakkuk is that he brings his concern to God, which is a misunderstanding of the sovereignty of God over the evil world. And Habakkuk does so all along expecting to be corrected. This is a sure sign of a mature believer. This is a person who is discerning enough to know when something doesn't seem right, but he has enough faith to place the burden of proof on himself rather than on God. Habakkuk is essentially saying, God, I know something here doesn't quite make sense, so either I'm wrong or you're wrong, but I know that you can't be wrong, so please correct me, because I want to grow as a child of God more completely. And this certainly is the proper attitude to have, an attitude that we see in Habakkuk. In all practicality, I think this is a very rare attitude in our society, and it does explain a lot about the state of our society. Let us now shift our focus to the tower, to the ramparts, depending on your translation. Ramparts is a word that's not very relevant to our day and age anymore, but ramparts basically was a tower from which a watchman would look out for approaching enemies, and maybe even for messengers bringing good news. And the symbolism here is very strong. Habakkuk is sitting by himself in a tower where he is on the lookout for danger from the enemy, and he does so for good reason, because God told him that they will fall to the Babylonians. So he's going up there in his tower and waiting for this. But Habakkuk is also waiting for God's judgment as well. So these were the two reasons that he took his position in the tower. And that is why I entitled this message, Tower Talk. That's where he was when he was talking to God. So let's make this personal now. Are you, metaphorically speaking, taking a position in the tower or the rampart? God never once instructed his people to stick their heads in the sand, turn their backs, what have you. Christ instructed his disciples to follow him and to not go home and wait until he returns. We always need to keep on the lookout, not only for the enemy, but especially we need to keep a lookout for those who are still in need of salvation. I've said it before and I'll say it again, that time is short. No one knows when God will send his Son back to earth, so if you're not ready, there won't be a second chance. The job of the watchman is to warn others. The watchman can't drag everyone to safety, especially against their will. If those who are warned don't heed the warnings of the watchman, their demise is on them. The watchman did his job, and that is what we are called to do. That's where Habakkuk was, because he recognized the reality of God's judgment. These are things to think of during your own tower talk with God. Now, this past week, when I was filling out the bulletin, I asked Brother Eric what song he had in mind to sing. That way I don't plan the same one for the rest of the service. And when he told me In the Garden, I had already had the bulk of this message done, and it made so much sense, and I thought it fit in perfectly with this message. I didn't even tell him what I had planned for the theme of the message. Being in the tower and talking with God and conversing with Him is just like being in the garden in that song. But sadly, many don't converse with God, at least on a regular basis. And many people live their lives as if there will never be a divine judgment. Their refusal to accept reality makes that reality no less real. Judgment is all too real, and no one will escape it. Consider this story about men who tried to escape judgment. In 1975, there were 75 prisoners in Saltillo, Mexico, and they had masterminded an elaborate escape plan. For 5 months, they dug down through the dirt floors of the prison without being noticed, and imagine their excitement as months went on. They finally thought they had dug far enough to get outside of the prison walls. So they burrowed up towards the surface. Don't ask me how they did this, but they tunneled up through the floor thinking they were free at last. And of all the places they could have wound up, they broke through in a courtroom that was in session. This is not a joke. Seriously, you cannot write this kind of stuff because people wouldn't believe you. And I verified this with several different sources before presenting it to you. Needless to say, they were not free after all. Just as men cannot escape punishment, just as these men could not escape punishment, it is impossible for the unsaved to escape God's judgment too. Now, when I look outside, and we finally have a day that resembles spring, pretty soon flowers will be in bloom, and days are getting longer, and best of all, after 5 dark and dismal months, I am happy to welcome back baseball season. And I get an amen. Whether you like baseball or not, and I hear that some people actually do not enjoy this essential piece of Americana. It is strange but true. But I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to assume that everyone here has heard of the man named Babe Ruth. And I'm not talking about the candy bar either. There is a story about one time in a game where the great Babe Ruth was called out on strikes. And the home crowd booed the umpire loudly, and Babe played off of the crowd's anger. Turning to the umpire, Babe said, "There are 40,000 people here who know that last pitch was a ball." Everyone in the stadium expected Babe to be ejected from the game for arguing balls and strikes as he should have been. But the umpire kept his cool and replied matter-of-factly, "Maybe so, Babe, but mine is the only opinion that counts." You see, the human race needs to realize God's judgment is the only opinion that counts in the end. If only our society would realize this fact, then I think we might see unprecedented revival. Winding it down now, to sum up a bit of what we've learned today from Habakkuk. Sometimes God just can't win with us because we think we have to understand what he does and why he does it and give him our stamp of approval. And I think this is a large contributing factor to the lack of blessing by God on his people. He rewards those who willingly accept the plan that he has ordained for each and every one of us and for this world. Many times God chooses a solution that doesn't seem to make any sense to us whatsoever, and like Habakkuk, we question his methods. Where we depart from Habakkuk is that we insist on God acting on our terms alone, whereas Habakkuk was a model of a mature believer. He stationed himself at the lookout because God had warned him of the coming tribulation, and he patiently waited for a response. The enemy wants to make us impatient because he knows that our impatience is a key for us missing out on God's answer. He wants our faith to be as weak as possible. Therefore, we need to make sure that we direct our tower talk to God and not to the enemy. This week, when you have your prayer time, and if you're praying about a trial or an injustice or some concern that you wonder why God doesn't do something about this, or why God's doing something that you just don't understand, will you, like Habakkuk, figuratively say, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and whatever answer I am to give to this complaint. You might be surprised what God will do when you exhibit the kind of patience and respect for him that he deserves. Let us now bow our heads and pray to the one who honors believers who exhibit patience and respect for him. Heavenly Father, we are thankful for your servant Habakkuk.